Canada is one of the nicest countries in the world, and suddenly Canada discovers that being nice to your neighbor for 50, 60 years means nothing. and in some ways, I'm glad you raised that issue, because there's one point I didn't emphasize at the beginning of my remarks, which is that geopolitics is the most cruel game in the world. And we are today, in terms of geopolitical shifts of power, experiencing far more geopolitical shifts of power, and I give you some example, than any other time. And it's very important, therefore, for countries, even nice countries like Canada, have got to understand that being nice is not enough. That you got to learn to be very geopolitically shrewd and cunning and Machiavellian if you're going to survive in this world. And I would say in terms of our world order, you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to adapt the established top-level institutions, UN, IMF, and so on and so forth. There are other institutions that are rising in an ad hoc fashion. And clearly among these organizations, some are sunrise and some are sunset. So I give you the obvious example. Until recently, one of the most powerful organizations was the G7 countries, right? It was the United States and 6 other European members plus the European Union. And at one time, when the leaders met, all the G7 leaders look equally strong. Today, when you watch meetings of G7 leaders, it's like Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. And you know, I'm not even exaggerating. And I mean, one of the photographs that will go down as one of the defining moments of the 21st century is the photograph you saw recently of President Donald Trump in his White House, sitting at the desk. And all the European leaders were sitting in the sofa like children in front of their school teacher. I mean, that photograph was so damning. And this is the same Europe that says, we will not give up our seats, we are very powerful. They behave like school children. But that's an illustration of how power shifts have happened. By contrast, if you look at BRICS, right? BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's clearly a sunrise organization because a lot of countries are applying to join, right? It's interesting. No one is applying to join the G7, but with BRICS, everyone is rising. But that's an example of how power is also shifting. But there are also another important organization which I think right now is having a rough time, which is the G20. The G20 at the end of the day will become more significant in the decades to come. And the G20, as you know, was formed as a result of a global financial crisis. And initially, only the finance ministers used to meet. But after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, even George W. Bush convened a meeting of the G20 leaders to try and deal with the global financial crisis. So that's an example of how there are various forms of adaptation taking place. But these forms of adaptation are not enough. So it's important, therefore, for especially the Asian countries to work harder to say that their voice must be represented much more strongly. The China-India relationship, I think you should all know, is very complicated. And right now, well, actually until about 3-4 months ago, relations between China and India, they were not bad, they were very bad. I mean, they were not talking to each other, right? I mean, I'm sure you're all aware that after the clash that took place in Galwan in June 2020, China and India ties went in the nosedive. Fortunately, in the last few months, step by step, their ties have been improving. And I think it's likely that Prime Minister Modi is going to go to China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, I think, at the end of this month. And that's a big deal. It's a really big deal that the Prime Minister of India is going back to China. But I think for the China-India relationship to improve, a lot more work needs to be done by both sides. And here I must say that if I had been giving this talk here, even 4 months ago, I would have been very pessimistic about China-India relations. But we must thank one gentleman for significantly improving China-India relations. And this is the gentleman, he said, whose name I should not mention. But I have to give credit where it's due. And President Donald Trump's decision to impose a 50% tariff on India is one of the biggest shocks that India has ever got in recent times. But more than that, you know, as you all are aware, India and Pakistan also had a military clash a month or two ago. And after the military clash, President Donald Trump invited the Chief of Army of Pakistan for a special White House lunch. And the Indians saw this as a slap in the face for them. And so there is now, even as we are speaking, a tremendous amount of evaluation going on in Delhi about where India's place in the world is. And yeah, we are now in the midst, so you're going to watch a kind of a transition that is happening. So on the China-India front, hopefully things will be much better by the end of this year. Well, I think the one country, two system is actually a brilliant solution to the question of how you integrate Hong Kong into China. And I think that the important thing is that I believe China realizes that Hong Kong is a better asset to China if it actually keeps its differences rather than dissolving the differences and becoming just like any other Chinese town or city. And in fact, it's the differentiation is therefore becomes an asset to China. So if you can keep up your British, what they call common law traditions, which is what we have in Singapore also, and you keep that going and you keep up your modern business practices and everything, Hong Kong is therefore a bigger asset to China. But it's important, therefore, that the leaders of Hong Kong communicate that much more strongly, both domestically and internationally. Because I think that, frankly, and my sense is that at the end of the day, Beijing wants Hong Kong to succeed. Sure. And part of the reason why Beijing wants Hong Kong to succeed is because the United States doesn't want Hong Kong to succeed. I mean, it's a fact. I mean, I told you earlier on that geopolitics is a cruel business, right? In some ways, paradoxically, incidentally, because President Trump is one of the least ideological presidents of recent times, he, as you know, doesn't pay much attention to issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan, but his predecessor did. And so, for that reason, if China sees that Hong Kong is under threat, it's in China's interest to see the success of Hong Kong. But one last point about people, and I've used this analogy before. In the US-China contest, Hong Kong is going to become a political football. And if you are going to be caught in a geopolitical game, the Hong Kong establishment must develop geopolitical instincts and understand the game that is being played, and then understand sometimes when to dodge, when the arrows are coming.
Who is your favorite political leader, first among the dead and second among the living?
Well, among the dead is easier for me. It's certainly Lee Kuan Yew. And see, because I had an opportunity, one of the greatest privileges of my life is that I've shaken hands with world leaders, dozens of them. And none of the ones I met actually were as politically shrewd, frankly, as politically cunning as Lee Kuan Yew was. And I tell you, I was in 1999, I was in a room like this, small room, but all CEOs and people like George H.W. Bush was there, Henry Kissinger was there, Zbigniew Brzezinski was there, Sam Huntington was there, really formidable meeting. And at that meeting, there was David Frost interviewing George H.W. Bush. And David Frost asked George H.W. Bush, you met so many world leaders. Who's the one world leader who impressed you the most? Within a split second, George H.W. Bush said, Lee Kuan Yew. So, that shows you that among he was an amazing figure for a leader of a very small country. His influence was outsized. Okay, so that among the living is a very difficult question.
You mentioned several times about the restructuring of the Security Council, but I think on record, if I'm not mistaken, actually the US, Russia, UK, and France are in support of India's rise to be accepted into the Security Council as permanent member. But I think on the record, actually China is the only one which stands in the way. Am I correct that I've just checked that there could be hints of China dropping their opposition? I hope that happens, but so that doesn't seem to jive with your explanation that it's UK which stands in the way and they don't want to give up the seat. Yeah, maybe they don't want to give up the seat, but they seem to support the inclusion of India, but whereas China for now, I think does not.
Well, my first response to you is, whenever countries say in public that they support India, be careful. Because it's often the countries that are supporting you that are the ones that are best at undermining you. And by the way, I've seen with my own eyes, okay? Countries that in public would say, of course, we support India's inclusion. But then what you do, the way you prevent reform is that you introduce what I call poison pill amendments. And when you put in a poison pill amendment, you ensure that nobody can accept it, and therefore there can be no reform, and therefore India cannot get in. There are ways and means of your real position is not what your public position is. And so I'm not sure for the record exactly what China's position is. I don't think China has opposed India's admission, but I don't know whether or not China has publicly supported also any countries. But I do believe that it is in China's national interests to see a different UN Security Council. And I would say, don't listen to what countries say, observe what is their national interests. And that will tell you what their real position will be. Incidentally, in my book, The Great Convergence, you'll find that I have proposed a 7-7-7 formula, 7 permanent members, 7 semi-permanent members, and 7 elected members. And the reason why I propose 7 semi-permanent members is because For every country that wants to get in, there's a neighbor that says, why not me? So India wants to get in, Pakistan says, why not me? Japan wants to get in, South Korea says, why not me? Brazil wants to get in, Argentina says, why not me? But the most brilliant ambassador to the UN, I remember, was the Italian ambassador, because in the 1990s, when everybody was pushing for Japan and Germany to become permanent members, the Italian ambassador got very upset. He says, why are you pushing only for Japan and Germany? We, Italy, we lost World War II also. That's a true story. Amazing. But I tell that story to tell you that the opposition to reform is very deep, very subterranean, very cunning. So don't pay attention to public statements. Watch what's going on underground.
So you talked about the structural change that we've seen. But the global financial infrastructure is very much still denominated and anchored in the US dollar. So global trade, access to finance very much depend on access to dollar, including in places like Hong Kong. So how do you see this dollar dominance and the global financial infrastructure that's still very much anchored in a, say, US-centric system affect the path of globalization or structural change going forward? How does that affect dependence on dollar, if I might just ask that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The dollar is completely indispensable to the global financial system. The dollar will remain the global reserve currency for decades to come. And even if the Chinese economy becomes bigger than the US economy, and I think it could happen in, let's say, 10 to 15 years from now, the US dollar will still remain as the global reserve currency. That's a fact. But at the same time, some of the recent actions that have been taken by the US, by the West, have led to countries questioning their reliance on the US dollar. So for example, the seizure of the Russian assets of $300 billion is clearly illegal under international law. You can't do it unless the UN Security Council mandates it, right? But that gesture has led to many countries saying, now we got to hedge our bets. We cannot put all our reserves in US dollars. So there's a progressive, very slow process of moving away from the US dollar in many years. And the other danger that the US dollar faces is that now right now, for example, when China exports cars to Argentina, it gets paid with dollars. Argentina exports beef to China, it gets paid with US dollars. Surely you can create a new mechanism using blockchain technology and all that to bypass the US dollar. That hasn't happened yet, but the pressure to look for alternatives has grown significantly. So, I mean, I don't see any substitute for the US dollar in the near future, but the reliance on the US dollar will slowly drift down.